All right, hey folks. So we are now in time for the April Q&A, and in the tradition of fast lifts, we are doing it at the start of May. So I post these up onto my Instagram and my YouTube every month, and I'll carry on doing that. So feel free to ask your questions there. I also now do a live Q&A every Friday on my Patreon. So if you're interested in that, go take a look. Or if you just want to support my work, there's that option as well if you like what I do. All right, so let's carry on with the questions. Now I'm going to go from my YouTube first, and we'll go to the first question from Ruck Ritz. Now, he wrote it out in quite a lot of detail, but essentially what he's asking is, he's talking about the rep drop-off. You guys understand the concept, so I'll just quickly go over it again. So basically, the rep drop-off is a performance marker that I use to know that my clients are training hard enough. So that is, if you start with your first set of a number of sets across, you should see a drop-off in reps on subsequent sets, because that shows you created some fatigue, which is a good thing. So you probably hit the muscle quite well. So as a working example for what I'm talking about, let's say you were doing bench press. You started with 100 kilos on the bar. You did a first set of 12. You rested for a while. You came back to it and you got 9. Then you came back to it again after another few minutes of rest and you got 6. That's the rep drop off. So you go 12, 9, and 6. Now, if somebody is sat there and he's getting 10, 10, 10, then what does that suggest about the first and second set? It suggests you could go a little bit harder because you didn't go as hard as if you went on the final set. So it's just a case of, it's a marker that I can use to see if people are training hard enough. Now, there are other markers, but I've learned over the years from probably my clients, but also just looking at YouTube videos and Instagram, the amount of noise someone makes and the grimacing of the facial expressions, that's not really connected to the level of hard work. So as much as somebody might sort of make a grimace, might shout and scream, fall on the floor, it has very little correlation to hard work. So I tend to use other markers, which lets me know whether somebody's actually generating the right level of stimulus and fatigue. So that's what we're talking about. And the question was basically very simple. He said he wants to know why he gets more of a rep drop-off in higher reps and less of a rep drop-off with lower reps. It's a great question. So when he's doing 5 to 8 range, it's less of a drop-off. When he's doing the higher rep range, he gets much more of a drop-off, as do I. I've started to post my training videos up on Instagram a lot more as kind of like a demonstration of how you should be training. Just a demonstration of how I train. So I get the same thing. Now, I'll give you an analogy. It's like this. Let's say you had a cake to finish off. Okay, you had a big, massive birthday cake, okay? Now, in the first instance, your first birthday, you were only allowed to take off big chunks of that cake. So you split the cake 5 ways, right? And you could only have another chunk of cake if you were guaranteed to finish it off. So you take a big chunk of cake, great. Take another one, great. Another one, great. At a certain point, you're going to be like, I don't know. I'm not going to be able to finish that, so you leave it, okay? And so you come back to the cake maybe a couple of hours later, the next day, and you're feeling quite fresh. Now, because you didn't go quite as close to the end of the cake, the end of the cake would be like failure, how much you could possibly fit in your stomach. Now, let's say we gave you a different situation. Let's cut them up in smaller chunks. Okay, with smaller chunks, you can get closer to the end because you're not confronted with this massive slice of cake every bite, right? You're confronted with smaller and smaller bits. You're like, I can have a little bit more. Yeah, a little bit more. A little bit more. You can get just that little bit closer to failure, to fatigue. So with the high repetitions, as long as you've got your mind right, it's actually easier to get deeper into the set. And that's why. So you basically generate more fatigue and you usually generate more stimulus. I really like those rep ranges. The rep ranges, particularly for the first set, in about the 10 to 20, more accurately, more like the sort of 12 to 18 range. I think they're great. I think they're fantastic. So they generate a huge amount of fatigue for me, a huge amount of stimulus. They really see my reps dropping off. I think they're fantastic. The low repetitions, I mean, they generate a lot of the wrong type of fatigue for me. So I don't like them as much. And I find I don't get as good a stimulus to fatigue ratio. on those. I should more accurately say the higher repetitions gets me more stimulus, not more fatigue, but they do also seem to generate more of a rep drop off. So that's why basically the higher rep range, it's a slightly better range for hypertrophy, in my opinion, because it seems to be the perfect balance between stimulus to fatigue. I still think some exercises are better in the 5 to 10 rep range, lower rep range, things like your bench press, your squat, where coordination comes into play, but they still give you an excellent stimulus. Like, I still think bench presses are great for the chest. I still think squats are great, for the quads, as long as they're nice, deep squats. So I like them for the lower rep range. But in terms of the higher rep stuff, I think it's generally better, particularly for machine exercises and things like that. So that's the reason you can basically get more stimulus from those high repetition sets. I wouldn't say they're out and out better, but in some circumstances they definitely are, like machine work, stuff like that. Okay, so next up is Judah Silverman. He says, can you provide any objective markers of how long, when to end your bulk besides blood glucose? I know Dr. Mike says 16 weeks and that you shouldn't bulk any faster than 0.5% body weight. Any thoughts or comments on this? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that if you were working with Dr. Mike, I'm sure he wouldn't flat out say you've got to do 16 weeks and that's it. Bear in mind, those are very general recommendations. And I think it's important to remember when you're watching your favorite YouTuber, Mike included. Mike's great. He's been a personal trainer for ages. He's very good at what he does. But it's important to remember a lot of their recommendations are going to be fairly general. So if you're working with Mike or one of his crew, they wouldn't just say, right, 16 weeks, that's what we're doing, be it, there or bust. He would probably tailor it to how you feel week to week and maybe cut the bulk short if you are really struggling. So I specify blood glucose. I think that's a pretty good marker. And I also looked at blood pressure, which I think is also a pretty decent marker. A lot of those things for smaller natural guys aren't really going to get out of whack. And if they do, then you've really messed up. Like if you're a natural guy who weighs, I don't know, 170, 160, and you've bulked like 20, 30 pounds to the point where your blood pressure is bad and your blood glucose is bad consistently every morning, then that's a clear sign. I mean, you've done something really wrong there. So in terms of more objective markers, probably just body fat percentage. Take some measurements, take some pictures, objectively look at where you're at, and I think that's better. Try not to rely on just how you feel, because how you feel is always going to feel worse the further you are away from where your body likes to sit, and that is leanness, bulk, etc. And we have to take a bit of discomfort if we're trying to reach our goals. That is it. That's the definition, So yeah, I would look for things like blood pressure, as well as blood glucose, body fat percentage, pictures, how you look. Another thing is how you perform. This is a big one. I think with some people you can get so out of shape. I mean, you would have noted long before this happens, but it can affect your performance in the gym. So you might just feel sluggish and lethargic. You might have really bad lower back pumps. Like those are all surefire signs that you have way overdone it. I mean, I remember getting lower back pumps in my powerlifting days, and like it's debilitating. And I'm always a lot leaner now. I just never get anything like that at all anymore. And some of those squat sets would just put me on the floor because my lower back would be so pumped, and it's so pumped that it's painful. It feels like an injury, but it's not. So yeah, I just don't get that anymore. I'm in far better shape. So those are fairly clear signs that you've really overdone it. And so I'm going to answer this question, with the assumption that you're a natural. But if you're enhanced, a lot of those things like blood pressure and blood glucose, you've really got to keep an eye on, because a lot of that can go south pretty fast. On that note, actually, this is for naturals and for enhanced people, taking supplementation to hold that at bay is something you really need to be careful about. So if you start to take, say, berberine is a GDA, it's a glucose disposal agent, and people can use that to reduce their blood glucose, which is fine. Like it's a good thing to take, if it's high. The problem is, though, it starts to be used as a crutch to mask things that are going on in the body. So if you use berberine to reduce your blood glucose, great, and it will have a mechanistic effect. It will literally leave you healthier. But the problem is, if you start to use it then for extended periods of time, rather than take it as a sign that, yeah, maybe I can eke out, I don't know, maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 or 4 more weeks of this bulk, rather than say, okay, I'm fine. I'm going to take my berberine and then I'm going to keep on increasing the dose and I'm just going to carry on getting fat. That's probably the worst thing to do. At that point, you really have to reevaluate and go, okay, what is this supplement actually covering? And it's probably covering for the fact that you need to diet. So just be very careful with the use of some of these supplements because they can be quite effective, like very effective. But therein lies the problem as well. So don't use things like that to mask other problems. But anyway, hopefully, Judah, that was a good answer to your question. Okay, now I've got a couple of questions here from two people which are both relatively similar, so I'm going to answer them together. Hayes S and SMK. They're both asking about the best tricep exercise. Hayes is talking about the best in general. SMK is talking about the best in a home gym. I want to get you guys to get out of the mindset of what is best and instead look for what makes an effective exercise. Let's break that down. Now, the first thing that I've sort of stated earlier in this video was stimulus to fatigue ratio, which I think is super important. So how much stimulation are you getting on the triceps relative to how taxing the exercise is? Now, they're both important parts, okay? So maximum stimulus, it's got to feel good. And I do believe part of the stimulus is you've got to look at pump and disruption. Like you've got to look at your pump. I think it's just a thing you've got, and people will always come out with these really inane arguments like, well, I can get a pump riding a bike. We're not talking about riding a goddamn bike. Stop making that analogy. It doesn't make any sense. We're talking about lifting weights in the gym. What is it with some people? Well, I could do that riding a bike. We're not talking about riding freaking bikes, are we? We're talking about being in the gym on a sensible routine, on the same routine you were on 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, and all of a sudden your pump drops off. Why does that happen? Please, people, stop with that analogy. It's dumb. So I do think pump and disruption is something which is useful because if something drops off, then it probably means you need to change your pace. So I look for what makes it for a good pump, what gets you a good pump in your tricep, what lets you see the rep drop-offs. And again, typically we're looking at the higher rep ranges. What feels okay? So with a lot of tricep exercises, people's elbows get hammered. And more than likely, that's because people really overdo the bench pressing per week. So their pressing volume is very high. And so they try and add tricep volume on top of that and it just becomes a mess. And they're like, oh, God, the skull crushers, they wreck my elbows. When the reality is they're doing like 20 sets of bench press every week because they want to get the bench up and maxing every Monday. And it's just, forced reps, bouncing off the bar, bouncing the bar off the chest. And then they sit back and go, oh, yeah, it's the skull crushers that messed up my arms. Like, no, it wasn't. It was a whole program. It was mental. So, good stimulus to fatigue, good pump, good disruption. It's got to feel good. It can't feel injurious. Now, to that end, what I'd rather talk about is actually what are some of the repetition ranges and the styles of execution. I quite like the higher rep ranges. Anywhere between 20 to 30, particularly for tricep extensions, skull crushers works great. Push downs, 10 to 20 range works pretty good. Close grip benches, even in that 10 to 20 range as well, again, works pretty good. It's a good range to work in. So, yeah, I think rather than focus on individual exercises, focus on how you can mold an exercise to make it feel really good. Because ultimately, over the course of a lifetime, you're going to rotate exercises. So if I was to say to you, Hayes, okay, yeah, great. The close grip incline bench is the best tricep builder. Fantastic. After 6 months, it'll stop working for you. So now what? You look back and go, Faz is full of shit. How dare he? How dare he sit over there in his ivory tower in England talking about best exercises, and he's wrong. So I'm not going to say that because there's no point. You need to look at what makes an effective exercise, and you can make pretty much every exercise effective for you if you try and manipulate some of the variables to make it feel good for you. Okay, so that makes sense. It's the same with USMK. Best tricep exercise for the home gym, make them feel good. If you're going to do a tricep extension, play around with the rep range. You owe it to yourself to try rep ranges in the 10 to 20 rep range, or 20 to 30 rep range. Try supersets. A classic superset is tricep extension straight into close grip bench press. Try that. Try tricep extensions into push-ups. Try a variety of different tricep exercises. You'll find something that fits you for that moment. Hammer it for as long as it works, and then move on to something else. All right, so hopefully that gave you a better answer maybe than the one you were looking for. But honestly, I feel that I wasn't trying to be dismissive of your actual questions. I just don't think you're asking the right questions, both of you. All right, S. Lee says, if you're going on vacation for a week, would you still try to find a way to work out, or would you just enjoy the trip? I went away recently for about a week, and I worked out once in a hotel gym. just because I kind of wanted to. I wasn't especially going out of my way. I think for a week, you may as well take the time off. I think if you're going away for a couple of weeks, that's when you want to maybe consider. One of my friends, he's the owner of a local gym around here. He emails the hotel, and he asks them for pictures of the gym, which is quite cool. If he's going away for 2 or 3 weeks, that's what he'll do. Sometimes he goes out to Cuba and places like that, and they usually have really well equipped gyms. So he gets emails back with pictures, and he's happy with that. But if you're going away for a week, I think you just relax. What I would say is, if you can, try and train up to that point. So, for example, maybe plan it so you're planning a deload during the holiday period. So, because if you're going to take a week off, you may as well make it a productive week of rest when you need rest. So I would train a little bit harder, do a bit more volume, perhaps a bit more train to failure, almost force the deload, okay, and then go into the holiday a little bit fatigued and ready for a deload, so you can take advantage of all the extra food and the rest and relaxation. That's the way I would play it. Yeah. Okay. Pinoy Aesthetic, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, said this is quite a long message, but he says basically, what do you think of bands and weighted calisthenics for hypertrophy, if done correctly? Okay. And he goes on to say he's made the majority of his progress with calisthenics. Now, look, if you've made the majority of progress with calisthenics for the last 12 years, hey, who am I to say anything? If you've made progress, great. I happen to think weighted calisthenics are fantastic because they're basically just bodybuilding exercises, dips, chins, stuff like that. It's fantastic. And he also said his leg work is mostly like knees over toes guy stuff. Great, sounds fine. I have no problem with that. And again, I'll maybe point you to a similar answer that I gave about the tricep question. Let's, rather than focus on specific exercises, why don't we try and focus on the top-down principles of what works? So, how much volume do you need per week? How effective is that exercise for you? How effective are you making it for you? Oftentimes, when people move to calisthenics, they end up using slightly higher repetition ranges, fuller ranges of motion. And that feels good. Sometimes they're just more emotionally involved in the lift because they're like, yeah, I'm doing calisthenics. Great. Some people hate them. I would personally hate a routine of entirely calisthenics, but that's personal preference. But my point is more a case of, rather than focus on specific exercises, can we not just look at the principles? Because the muscle doesn't really know whether you're doing a weighted dip or a bench press. It doesn't really know. It's just contracting against load. Like, yeah, maybe you could argue some parts are more or less stimulated, but in general, it's just contracting against load. Why don't we look at things like style of movement, execution, intensity, how hard you're working, how much volume you're doing across the week, how close to failure you're training, all of those kind of things. You can make pretty much any exercise a good exercise. There are good principles for that to work. Use a full range of motion, all these kinds of things. Make sure they're safe for you. As long as you're not doing anything too stupid, like partial squats, quarter squats in the Smith machine against the bench, like something like just really just wacky like that, then you're probably fine. So rather than focus on specific exercises, maybe focus on execution and setting it up. Personally, I have no problem with calisthenics at all. I think they're fine. And as you say, you've worked out and you've made some really good gains with that. So I think you're doing great. Keep it up. Right. So Bill Monty has another bulking question, and it's a good question. Bill is also one of my Patreon supporters, so thank you so much, Bill. At what point would you consider cutting off a bulk to be shooting your gains in the foot? Okay. Now, before I read the rest of this, I'll just say that's something that people do a lot. So it's a really good question. A lot of people don't give the bulk enough time, so it ends up just being a mess. Given my experience, it's the best gains happen early in the phase. If you have something coming, you want to be a bit leaner for like an event or a season like summer, at what stage would it be detrimental to go for it? Appreciate the insight as always. Thank you, Bill. I have a number of people doing that right now. There's one guy who I've mentioned in my videos before, but he keeps coming up, Adam. Adam, we just finished a cut with Adam about 2 months ago, and he looks great. He's really lean. Now, we've been lean bulking for a couple of months, and he's basically just kept the same level of leanness the whole time. Like, picture difference is imperceptible. It's just simply fullness, and he's gained a ton of strength. He's currently at all-time PBs. Now, he does have an event coming up. I have said to him, we don't need to necessarily cut, but he kind of wants to because he has this thing coming up. I think there's somewhat of a lifter psychology here as well, because if you're not at your absolute 100% crisp end of cut best, you're like fat, right? We've all experienced that, haven't we? You know, I mean, I remember I did my bodybuilding show in 2018, and 6 weeks later, I still had abs. I was still, nice, really lean, and I was heavier, and I was, more full. I was more bloated with all the carbs and stuff. And I remember thinking, man, I just don't look as good, which is just a ridiculous thing to say because, compared to before or whatever, you still look fantastic. So I think just be careful that you're not cutting for that reason. I mean, I follow Bill on Instagram and he looks great. I'm not sure what impression he has in his own head about how he looks and whether that's realistic or not. So I would say it's a case of maybe look at some honest before and afters, like where you finished your cut, where you are now, and objectively look at how you'd want to look. Just be aware though that, you might just have a much better time just carrying on the bulk because like Bill's anything but fat. He's not fat at all. He's in really good shape. He's got good arm definition, delt definition. I've not seen the rest of him, but he looks like he's in shape. He looks like he works out. If he was to go on a cut now, never mind the whole thing about losing, gaining momentum, he might not be as happy. He's eating plenty of food. He's training really good. And yeah, sure, you've got an event coming up, but you train every day. You train, sleep, eat every day. So if all those things are going to be negatively affected, you have to kind of figure out, well, is it worth it? And Bill's definitely not at the point where it's too much, as in from a health standpoint. And I would say that if it was. So I think that's one of those things where for you, Bill, it's a very real consideration that you might be shooting yourself in the foot. But yeah, I don't know what you look like the rest of you. So why don't you take some before and afters and objectively sit down and look at them and go, okay, am I being unreasonable here? Do I want to be a bit crisper? Or actually, you know what? I'm pretty happy making great gains in the gym. I'm eating food that I like. I'm sleeping well. I'm training really well. I mean, training when you're in a surplus feels differently to when you're in a deficit. Training when you're in a surplus feels amazing. You get good pumps. It feels fantastic. Training when you're in a diet just feels crap. Let's face it, after a while. So just bear in mind all the factors. Okay. Now, Sin Ak, who's one of my clients, says, when coming back from a deload, how much weight should one begin the next cycle? Same as week before deload or some fraction, 10% less of the weight? Yeah, good idea. Good question, sorry. Okay, so I think it depends on how long the gaining cycle is. So with Seth, we work in roughly 5 or 6 week blocks, which is a good average. And I started Seth off on that. We used to do 3 week waves, but now we're moving to 6 week blocks, 5 weeks loading, 1 week deload. And I want to see how he adapts to that. Because of that, the idea is to have a bit of runway. So you want to try and Seth is still at the point where he can be in all-time PRs pretty much every block. So he's still at the sort of intermediate stage where gaining per block is very, very doable. So you don't want to be too aggressive from the beginning. So you do want to leave a bit of room to push. However, I always base it on how the client feels. This is the best way to do it. So let's say you start warming up for a lift and it feels really awful. And you think, ugh, this is going to suck. And it kind of puts that in your mind for the rest of the session. Well, don't attempt even matching the previous block. Go down a little bit. Okay. Now, if you go in the gym, you feel really good. Fantastic. You might even equal your weight from last week or the week before, or you might even put it up. It all depends on how your body reacts to the deload. And it's because of this. With a lot of people, me included, when I used to deload, I would come back stronger, always, without fail. It was very unusual. So I would push and push and push to the point where I needed to deload. Oftentimes when I first started deloading, if I attempted to go in that week and lift heavy, I just couldn't lift it. I specifically remember being a 200 kilo plus deadlifter and on a deload week, not being able to pick up a 100 kilo barbell. That's how just fatigued I was. So when I rested and I came back, I was stronger. So for me, the deloads were simply just fatigue management. I would come back stronger. For a lot of people, it tends to derail them. So we have to question with those people either whether they needed a deload in the first place or whether their body just simply detrains very quickly. But it's a case of individualizing. We have to see how the lifter feels, which is why I encourage you to warm up on the day and see how things feel. Have a loose plan and have a contingency. If it feels good, you're going to push it. You're going to go back to your regular weight and see how it goes. If it doesn't feel good, and be honest with yourself, pull it back 10%. But note it all down and let's look at the trends. That's more valuable. Rather than hard and fast rules, let's look at the trends and then let's try and fix things so that it's more predictable next cycle. Let's figure out, okay, why did what happen? And let's try and put together a plan so we can be more instructive next time. And this is how I first discovered deloads. I've told the story many times. I emailed Dan John back in like 2002. And I asked him, and he said, look in your training diary and try and figure out when your body starts to break down. And my body started to break down every 3 weeks. And I was trained like a maniac, just like heavy singles, heavy fives, everything, heavy, loads of volume. And my body could stand it for like 2 weeks. And it wasn't just like to failure. It was just insanely hard work. Like everything was to failure and beyond, I mean, bear in mind, I came from that sort of Dorian Yates style background. It was almost like the sets that I counted were the ones that I took to failure and beyond. So the sets that I counted were the ones with forced reps. It was like a negative RPE, negative RIR. I had like -2 in the tank. So that caused me to burn out every 3 weeks. And so when I took his advice, I didn't change the way I trained. All I did was I deloaded every 3rd week, and I had the best run of training I've ever had, really, for that whole 1.5 year period. So yeah, go in with a loose plan, evaluate that at the end of the block, and then figure out, okay, how do we get to this point? What worked best? And then let's note that for next time so we can make this more predictable. It's the best way to do it. Your training diary is the best training tool you have. Okay, we're going to go for one more question. I love answering these questions as the last question because it's a really good one. Do you think the evolution of the sports supplement industry is a good thing? It could be a minefield, but I'm glad the flavoring of products has improved since the mid-2000s. Yeah, I'll be honest with you, Jimmy. I am really surprised the supplement industry has thrived the way it has. I honestly thought it would die out a long time ago. And I'll tell you why. So back when I was younger, things like ephedrine were legal. Right? So you guys all talk about the original Jack 3D formula. You don't know you're born. The original Ultimate Orange actually had ephedrine in it, right? It would literally blow your head off. Ephedrine is so hardcore, it's literally illegal right now. It's been banned in multiple countries. So, and that was just being taken as a casual sports supplement by your average 15-year-old. So supplements back then, there were a lot of the supplement industry was very dodgy back then. And there was companies who were just lacing their weight gainers with D-ball and stuff like that. It was the wild, wild west. But for what, that stuff worked. Like it really actually worked. The most you guys get now is pre-workouts laced with caffeine and like beta alanine. So they literally have to put something into the formula to make your butthole itch so that you get the placebo effect that it's doing something. Because, I guess if my butthole is itching, then this must be a great pre-workout. That makes no sense. I think there's something to do with blood flow on some of them as well, like NO oxidizers and stuff like that. But again, back in the day, people were taking Cialis pre-workout for that stuff, which worked a lot better. So basically, after the banning of all the effective supplements, there was left some pale shadows of what were effective supplements. And that's what the supplement industry is right now. So with regards to performance enhancing stuff, what we have on the market now is close to being placebo and pathetic. The only thing that actually works really is creatine. You could argue testosterone as well, but I'm not convinced. When you look at the major thing that people were buying in the early 2000s, BCAAs, look what happened to that. Now people are buying EAAs. Who knows? It might be good, it might not be. We will see. But my point is the performance enhancing stuff, if anything, it's gotten a lot worse to the point where it's almost ineffective, aside from creatine. Now, when it comes to protein, this is an even worse situation. I'm so surprised that protein shakes are still in use by the majority of people. They're basically a casual's way of getting in protein. And I'll tell you why. Okay, so if that statement outrages you, let me tell you why. Go and look up, open another tab, keep this video playing. Go and look up Day of Eating with Ronnie Coleman, or Day of Eating with Jay Cutler, or Day of Eating with Dorian Yates, and just come back and show me how many protein shakes they're eating. And not advertisements, not adverts of Ronnie Coleman advertising protein powder or his supplement company. Go to an actual Day of Eating when he was Mr. O and tell me how many protein shakes he had on a regular daily basis alongside one of his 6 to 10 meals a day. Same with Jay Cutler. Go ahead. I'll wait. None. We know the formula for building a big body. We know what it is. It's repetitive meals over the course of the day, the whole chicken and rice mantra. It's over and over again, keeping blood sugar levels stable, protein levels high, all that kind of stuff. We know what works, and it's not protein powder. I'm stunned that the protein industry is still active. It's basically just catered to casuals. Yeah, I'm going to slam a shake, and I'm going to slam an apple because that's the same. It has, it's high quality protein, all that stuff. I'm very surprised that the supplement industry has lasted for that long for that reason, because it's just not in the solution for most big bodybuilders. And those are the ones that we all try and emulate to our little degree. So I think it's good. I think it's for casuals. I think it's not something which it's for people who, need more convenience. So for that, it's fine, but I wouldn't say it's anything close to optimal, because a lot of them lack nutrients and whatnot. And so it's generally better to have a big meal. So yeah, I think, just going back to the original question to make sure I've answered it, the evolution of the sports industry, I think they're hanging on by a thread, to be honest. Mostly, if you look at the advertising, it's mostly aimed at casuals, because bodybuilders aren't having all this stuff at all. It's mostly aimed at casuals, using bodybuilders as these paragons of how you should eat and train, ignoring the fact that the majority of them are on drugs, which means you can't really tell whether what they're doing is working or not, if it's the protein powder or something else. So not to be really cynical, but it's just not. I'm just shocked at how people still buy into it. Like, people will still buy BCAAs and insist they're getting a buzz off them. I actually had someone say that to me years ago. The lad was very simple, but still, like, even for a simple guy, I mean, that is quite something. He bought BCAAs. He said, yeah, they give me a buzz, Faz. And I said, look, they're placebo. He said, now they give me a buzz. Back at the ingredient list, nothing but BCAAs, no caffeine, no nothing. Gave him a buzz. Maybe the cold water he used perked him up a little bit. I don't know, but it's people like that, just brainlets like that, who fuel the supplement industry. I think if you're a regular guy who needs a protein shake because you've got a busy life, fair enough, got no problem with that. But my point is more like, I think a lot of this is pushed for casuals. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's basically the idea. Yeah, and yeah, I think we're all glad the flavoring is improved. Definitely. All right, folks, I'm going to call it there, and I will see you tomorrow for the remainder of the questions.